States-European relations today and tomorrow. All of us retain a very basic and ongoing interest in the policies of our friends in Europe, enormously important political actors. Those relationships are always less than perfect, and they've perhaps been a little more strained over the last several years for reasons which most of you know. But the complex of Europe's relations today, when we're facing a new set of challenges, is extraordinarily important. And we're absolutely delighted to have the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs with us to talk about those issues. Mr. Ries has been in the Foreign Service since 1977. He's served in a variety of parts of the world. He's had extraordinary experience in economic matters. He was part of the energy policy development very early in his career. He served as both a special assistant and executive assistant to the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs. He was detached to the U.S. Trade Representative Office in the early 90s, worked on NAFTA, has served in Brussels as the United States Minister Counselor for Economic Affairs. He served in the same position, the same rank at least, Minister Counselor for Economic Affairs in our embassy in London before, in the year 2000, becoming our Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. I'm always amused by the titles in the State Department because assistant secretaries don't get all the respect which they should in our society. But of course, as you all know, the assistant secretary himself is responsible, herself in this case, responsible for, or runs the bureau, which is responsible essentially for our diplomacy toward that enormous part of the world. And the principal assistant secretary, our guest this evening, is the number 2 man in that bureau. The assistant secretary brings an extraordinarily interesting background, very strong in economics, and we're delighted to have him with us. Mr. Ries.
Thank you very much, Frank. I'm delighted to be here, and I think I may come back next week to find out the road onward from Iraq. That sounds like an interesting program, and there are this many people that hear about Europe. Imagine that you may need to add extra chairs out in the outlining parts. I also reminded, when you talk about titles, I told my mother the first Washington rule of titles, which is the longer the title, the less important you are. It's probably well known among this knowledgeable group, but you know, a special assistant to the president is less important than an assistant to the president. So the longer the title gets, the more distant you are from power. Remember, there's a Secretary of State, and everyone else is subordinate to Secretary Powell. But thank you very much for that generous introduction. I'm very pleased to be here tonight to speak for a few minutes about contemporary Europe and U.S.-European relations. Baltimore, I have to say, has a special place in my heart. I have 2 degrees from Johns Hopkins, an enduring love for crabs, and an appreciation of the finer points in lacrosse. So I feel very much at home. And I don't get up here but a couple of times every half year or so, and I always kick myself for not spending more time in this wonderful city. I think this is also a good moment to take stock of U.S.-European relations. Secretaries Powell and Rumsfeld are both in Europe this week. Secretary Rumsfeld's already there, and Secretary Powell should be taking off in about 45 minutes. They're in Europe for meetings with their NATO counterparts, and in Secretary Powell's case, for meetings with the leaders of the 55 member countries of the OSCE, which is Old Europe, New Europe, and what might be called Wider Europe combined. Wider Europe comprising the Balkans, Eurasia, Caucasus, and and Central Asia. For Secretary Powell, this is his third trip to Europe in little over a month. In late October, he stopped in Madrid on his way back from Kenya in Africa to attend a donors conference for post-war Iraq. And I was privileged to accompany him to that. And that conference, not incidentally, raised $13 billion from friends and allies to complement the U.S. taxpayers' contributions to Iraqi reconstruction and Iraq's own earnings. And 2 weeks ago, Secretary Powell spent a day in Brussels consulting with foreign ministers from the 25 EU member states and member states-to-be, and I was also present there. He then went on to join President Bush for the state visit to the United Kingdom, which is, of course, our closest ally and friend in the whole world. Such a month of intense engagement with our European allies and friends is actually not unusual. It is no accident that in Britain they call the Atlantic the pond. Arguments and disagreements, of course, come with the territory, but so does effective cooperation and a common commitment to international challenges of our time: security, the fight against terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, promoting global economic growth and development, and improving the health and well-being of our planet and its inhabitants. One of the reviews of the new movie Master and Commander notes you should never trust a movie with a colon in its title. It tries to do too much. I thought of that when I was looking at the title for these remarks, U.S.-European Relations, today and tomorrow. And nevertheless, and mindful of the risks and dangers, I cannot start to talk about today and tomorrow without a brief word about yesterday. The strong foundation of today's U.S.-European relationship was laid in the darkest hours of the 20th century. It was a time when half of Europe came close to losing the freedoms that we often take for granted today. Among the events Secretary Powell attended in Brussels 2 weeks ago was a stop at our mission to the European Union to unveil a plaque commemorating 50 years of U.S.-European Union relations. In 1953, we sent an ambassador and opened an office to the European Coal and Steel Community, the first non-ECSC country to do so. The U.S. has been a partner in this endeavor with the European Union from its inception because we recognized that we had a stake in the outcome and that a strong, free, prosperous Europe was in our own best interests. We also believed from the beginning that our relationship was a partnership based on common vision of political and economic freedom for our peoples and the rest of the world. The plaque also symbolizes the fact that today's Europe, whole, free, and at peace for the first time in more than half a century, is a result of this vision and the sustained efforts of Europeans and Americans alike. Throughout the post-war period, there have been two constancies in American policy: support for the NATO alliance and support for European integration. Having such a bedrock under the transatlantic relationship, of course, never meant the surface went unruffled. In the past, we've had famous disagreements and continuous disputes over the wisdom of military actions at Suez and Vietnam, disagreements over how to counter Soviet missiles in Europe, and disagreements over European farm subsidies and U.S. trade remedy measures. This tradition of a relationship based on strong foundations, common values and commitments, and tolerant of occasional in-the-family arguments continues today. Before tackling a few of these, let me just point to some of the indicators of the U.S.-European relationship. We all know the scale of the $2 trillion U.S.-European trade and investment relationship, and especially in this town, Baltimore, a great port. But I find it striking that throughout most of the 1990s and into 2000, operations in Europe accounted for half of the total international investment earnings of U.S. corporations. And despite NAFTA, in the 1990s, U.S. firms invested nearly twice as much capital into the Netherlands alone as they did into all of Mexico. In 2001, EU companies were the source of over 2/3 of the total foreign investment in Maryland, some $9 billion in that year alone. And in the same year, Maryland sold 1/3 of its total exports to the EU. European investment and trade supports roughly 100,000 jobs in Maryland alone. When it comes to our security relationships, we have no better partner than Europe. Despite widespread doubts about our actions in Iraq in many countries, 20 European countries now have forces in Iraq, totaling over 20,000 soldiers. And 29 European countries, including France and Germany, have over 4,000 military personnel in Afghanistan. In the Balkans, the EU is the single largest donor to the reconstruction process and has over 36,000 troops stationed in Kosovo alone, 80% of international forces there. I'm always amazed at the extent of present-day U.S.-EU counterterrorism cooperation, which ramped up dramatically after the events of 9/11. The Justice Department regularly sings the praises of European countries for their willingness to share intelligence, make arrests, and freeze the assets of terrorist groups whose members reside or cross European territory. In fact, they have arrested more members of al-Qaeda than we have. The relationship between the United States and Europe is arguably the most important political and economic relationship in the world. We cooperate in countless international arenas to make the world a better, safer place. It is not an exaggeration to say that the U.S. and the EU consult on almost every major event in every country, seeking to find common ground, cooperation, and coordinated action. While our partnership is strong, at times it may appear the fissures threaten its core. It is, of course, well known that the decision of the United States, the UK, and a number of other countries to enforce UN Security Council resolutions in Iraq created considerable tension among Europeans and between the Europeans and us. To some extent, this tension has yet to fully dissipate. However, both sides recognize that too much is at stake to lose sight of the shared values and responsibilities that have united us for so long. We understand we must use our combined resources to bring light and hope to people around the world who have suffered from conflict and oppression. Thus, the United States and Europe are working together to build a new Iraq and Afghanistan. The Iraq Donors Conference, as I mentioned, we welcomed the European Union's combined contribution of almost $1.4 billion. Last week, both the United States and Europe supported the International Atomic Energy Agency's resolution putting Iran on notice that there will be action in case of further violations of its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran is actively pursuing an extensive nuclear program in light of recent evidence, most of which was until recently undeclared and intentionally hidden. The United States believes the program is intended to develop nuclear weapons capability. The EU made clear to Iran that its clandestine nuclear activities have serious consequences for Europe's relations with Iran, and has been willing to use the leverage of future trade talks to pressure Iran to cooperate more fully with the IAEA. We welcomed, in this respect, the special efforts of Germany, France, and the UK to bring Iran into compliance with IAEA agreements and NPT obligations. We are similarly working together with the EU and Russia in the Quartet to get the Middle East roadmap back on track. We must make our message clear to both sides that the obligations and responsibilities outlined in the roadmap are the path to progress, and we expect performance. All sides now have to do the hard work and make the final decisions to move forward. The greatest threat to peace is the spread of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, and we're working closely with them to stop their proliferation. At the end of May, President Bush announced the Proliferation Security Initiative, envisaging a partnership of states working in concert to develop a broad range of legal, diplomatic, economic, military, and other tools to interdict shipments of WMD. Many of our European friends have joined us in this initiative. We have moved to broaden participation recently and anticipate working closely with many more European partners in the weeks and months ahead. At the US-EU summit in June, we agreed to cooperate more closely with the EU on other aspects of non-proliferation policy. We are working with the European Union on novel ways to protect the American people and Europeans from other terrorist risks. On November 18th, we initialed an agreement that allow cargo in containers to be better screened to prevent manipulation by terrorists, including the transportation of weapons of mass destruction. This will enable sea containers to pass more freely and securely between our ports, including the lovely one out here. We've greatly expanded our cooperation in freezing terrorist funds and in helping countries protect their own financial systems. Our recently negotiated mutual legal assistance and extradition treaties will give our courts and prosecutors extra tools for this. After September 11th, the added emphasis that everyone's placing on passenger screening in airports has created an inconvenience for travelers, as many of us know far too well. To help focus our attention on passengers posing the greatest risk and facilitate travel by legitimate passengers, the United States expanded the scope of existing screening programs while developing new ones focusing on identifying potential terrorists. We are close to an agreement with the EU allowing us access to airline passenger information that will improve our border and transportation security officials' ability to screen for terrorists while still respecting U.S. and EU data privacy rules. The conventional wisdom is that the $2 trillion investment and trade relationship between the United States and Europe is genuinely competitive, if not conflictual. This, like much conventional wisdom, is only half true and really quite misleading. As I mentioned earlier, the United States and the EU are each other's largest source of foreign investment and trading partners, which, of course, supports millions of jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. European investors own firms we consider American icons, companies like Chrysler, Shell, or Brooks Brothers. And American companies are creating viable futures for European firms, such as Jaguar, Saab, or Volvo. Although we tend to focus on our disputes, most of our economic relationship is conflict-free. This doesn't say that the disputes are not important. They are. The key is to manage them responsibly. Both the U.S. and the EU agreed to take difficult disputes to the WTO for settlement, even though WTO, the World Trade Organization, panels are making uncomfortable decisions against the U.S. On the case of foreign sales corporation tax provisions and steel, in the headlines, in fact, today, and against the EU on bananas, beef, and soon on biotech commodities. We are working with Europe to make it easier for transatlantic business to flourish. Special emphasis these days is on regulatory issues, since with the reduction of tariffs and quotas, regulatory differences are a main source of obstacles to trade. We have begun transatlantic aviation negotiations designed to further liberalize air traffic between the United States and Europe, which should certainly help BWI. For the State Department, Europe is not synonymous with the European Union or with the NATO alliance. Russia is also a European power and an important focus of our attention. With Russia, the stakes are huge. Russia is a key partner in the war on terror, disarmament, and non-proliferation, and in managing potential international crises such as North Korea. Russia's contributions reflect the view of a Russian leadership that sees its future increasingly tied to the West. Integration with Western structures, whether the G8 or the NATO-Russia Council, and good relations with the U.S. are fundamental to this approach. Beyond the area of global strategic cooperation, the U.S. has a tremendous amount to gain from a broad relationship with a market-oriented democratic Russia, especially in the energy field. However, 12 years after the end of the Soviet Union, Russian political and economic institutions are still a work in progress. The recent headlines about Russia, the Yukos affair, the detention of its head, businessman Hodorkovsky, and the conduct of the campaign for the upcoming parliamentary elections have raised concerns about the direction Russia is taking in its still incomplete transition. While the Russian leadership recognizes our shared interests in addressing global challenges, it is not clear where it wants to take the country or how committed it is to the rule of law, real media freedom, and vibrancy in civil society. While recent events cause concern, the picture is mixed, the situation fluid. We do have influence, and we will try to use it to keep Russia moving in the right direction, and we will work with our other European partners to achieve that. I mentioned Russia, but I could just have easily highlighted Turkey, the Balkans, or the Caucasus as key contemporary European policy arenas, in addition to our relationship to the EU that I started with. And I'd be glad to get into these topics a little bit more in the discussion period to follow. But mindful of my colon, what about tomorrow? What will our relationship be with European countries as we look ahead? What place will the transatlantic relationship have in the hierarchy of U.S. foreign policies a decade hence? Much depends on decisions that are being made much sooner than that. The European Union and NATO are both expanding. For both institutions, it is the culmination of a decade of work. The new members and the new international environment will reshape both. U.S. policy must evolve as well. The European Union will be perhaps the most dramatic example. Next May 1, it will take in 10 new member states, taking the total to 25. All except that an EU of 25 cannot be run with the institutions that were originally developed for an EU of 6. But all year there have been struggles among European countries and institutions about what changes will be made, and ample guessing about which interests will come out ahead. For the most part, the struggle is between the larger member states and the more numerous small member states. At stake is decision-making power and privilege. One issue that directly concerns us is EU foreign policy formulation. Most Europeans would like to see more of a common foreign policy for the European Union. So it seems likely that some variant of current proposals for a full-fledged foreign minister for Europe will come about, with this new person to be in charge of regular meetings of EU foreign ministers, as well as the fledgling European diplomatic service. And no, I don't think the strike in the French foreign ministry was as a result of that. As we've said previously, the United States will work with whatever institutional arrangements the Europeans may make. Secretary Powell would be among the first to congratulate an EU foreign minister. As in 1953, we would recognize that an evolving EU can be a powerful partner for progress in the world. NATO is changing as well, and it should, in order to keep up with the new threats to our common security and the capabilities we need to meet them. The NATO of tomorrow will be able to field more flexible, faster, and more effective military forces anywhere in the world. This is indeed part of what NATO ministers are discussing this week. The new NATO will be more outward-oriented. In addition to its important relationship with Russia and other partner nations throughout Europe and Eurasia, NATO will be helping countries elsewhere confront security challenges. One security policy issue that intersects with both NATO's tomorrow and the EU's is the future of the European security and defense policy, known inevitably as ESDP. The U.S. supports ESDP. In fact, we spent several years crafting a relationship between ESDP and NATO to ensure that ESDP would have full access to NATO's well-developed planning capabilities. Our goal was to avoid duplication or decoupling that might otherwise occur. That remains our basic approach. That is why we are concerned that an autonomous EU planning headquarters, as some have proposed, could be the start of a growing divide between NATO and ESDP, which would not be in either side's interests. To be clear, we don't oppose autonomous EU ESDP missions, just an autonomous planning center. I'd be glad to get into it in the question and answer period if you have the stomach for it. So other than adapting with EU and NATO enlargement, what are tomorrow's priorities for the transatlantic relationship? I would list 5. First, we must continue the fight against international terrorism, strengthening our bilateral work and enhancing international cooperation. Our objectives should be security for all peoples and nations. Second, and related to the fight against terrorism, We should strengthen global efforts against proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, as I've already discussed. Third, and in line with President Bush's recent speech, we hope to launch joint efforts to work with the peoples of the Middle East to promote democratic development, economic freedom, and security. Fourth, because one of the greatest sources of development and growth in any society is trade, we must lead the effort to eliminate global trade barriers. Both the U.S. and the EU were disappointed that talks broke down in Cancun, Mexico, 2 months ago. As Cancun demonstrated, the real diplomatic challenge is persuading the developing countries that mutual trade liberalization is the key to development and growth, and thus in their interest. It was only through U.S.-EU cooperation that Doha was launched, and the only way we will successfully finish it is by working together. And fifth, we must promote global health and support development in Africa. In Africa, the spread of HIV/AIDS threatens millions and the stability of an entire continent. President Bush has signed into law a $15 billion effort to prevent and treat AIDS in Africa and the Caribbean, and we are urging our European partners to make a similar commitment. Many countries have announced increased contributions on today, World AIDS Day. Hunger is, of course, an age-old scourge that also should not exist in the 21st century. Can the U.S.-European alliance do better in the future? Clearly it can. One thing we've learned is that it is critical to identify potential problems early and to address them before they become crises. Dean Acheson, many years ago, described the great European statesman Konrad Adenauer as someone who, quote, knew when it is essential to compromise in order to save a possible great future from the threat of present difficulties. Today and tomorrow, indeed. You might have thought it took an eternity, like one of Jack Aubrey's frigate chases. In any case, this is my report on the state of U.S.-European relations. Thank you for your attention coming out tonight, and I'll be glad to field any questions you might have.
Well, thanks very much for that comprehensive and very helpful overview. Yes, sir. Has our going into Iraq interfered with the war on terrorism, number one? And secondly, are steel tariffs, for example, ill-advised?
Okay. On the first, I don't think so. I think the evidence is that the cooperation on the war on terrorism from Europe has actually strengthened since the hostilities in Iraq. Clearly, in Iraq itself, there is terrorism where there was none before. You had an authoritarian society, you didn't have any terrorism. The attacks in Istanbul on the synagogue and the British Consulate General are quite similar to the attacks on the synagogue in Tunisia before the war, and there is very little evidence to support the idea that the Europeans have actually withheld cooperation on the war on terrorism as a result of their differences with us in Iraq. And actually, as I mentioned, most of the European countries made the very difficult domestic political decision to come with us into Iraq. There are more European troops today in Afghanistan doing more different jobs and more willing to take risks than were the case last fall before the Iraqi efforts. On steel, the president took the decisions he did to impose a temporary 3-year safeguard because he felt that the situation of the American steel industry, undeniably dire, met the standards of the Safeguard Act. The Europeans took us to the WTO. We lost. The WTO said that they didn't meet the standards of the WTO rules. We lost the appeal, and the president is presently considering what he might do. It is one of those calls that leaders make. Europeans have been maintaining a ban on U.S. beef since 1989. That the WTO, the GATT first, and then the WTO has found illegal multiple times, and they have not been moved to make any any similar steps to lift it. It is likely the EU also was found to be violating our trading rights in the banana case and in the oilseeds case, and U.S.-European relations went on. I mean, these are the kinds of things that happen. The President will be shortly announcing the decision on steel, and I think that you will see it as is adequately justified. And we don't believe that we have acted in a way that is not responsive to the requirements of the WTO. And because if we had done so, it would undermine our case that the Europeans need to do the same.
Question on terrorism. Why is the Basque terrorism so difficult, or by projection, any insurrection difficult to deal with?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not a great expert on Spanish domestic politics. I think that the Spaniards have tried very hard to deal with the sort of, some say, for example, that terrorism comes from anomie and sort of disaffection from being in a minority group that is oppressed by the majority, or being in a situation in which there is a hopelessness associated with an economic situation. The Basque region around Bilbao has benefited from extra Spanish government investment at the expense of Galicia and some of the other more outlying regions. And Bilbao today is a very prosperous place as a result. I mean, as prosperous as any Spanish city as a result of the very heavy government involvement. They have tried a wide variety of security measures to try and infiltrate and capture using the classic law enforcement and counterterrorism methods that have been tried elsewhere around the world. Basque separatists, and they have only the last 4 or 5 years gotten really full-fledged cooperation from the French, and there was a sort of trans-border element of it. I'm always impressed by the bravery of Spanish government officials. I have a good friend of mine who works for the Commission in Brussels, and his brother was killed by the Basques, and his uncle was wounded by the Basques. And I say, well, are you frightened? Because he comes from that region, and he was the ETA had identified his family as being supporters of Madrid, if you will, the federal government. And he said, well, we do what we have to do. And living in London during various IRA scares, it's quite amazing how tough people can be and resilient. And ultimately, the IRA drew the conclusion that it was better to negotiate than to bomb your way to power. At least there seemed to have a better future. So I guess, that's sort of random thoughts. I really don't know why. What the roots of Basque terrorism are. I think it's clearly a culture that has very deep separatist basis and a feeling of sort of almost a secret society. It makes it very difficult for the government to find the leadership and the money flows. They have said, the Spanish have been concerned that the Basque communities in the United States, basically out in Idaho and other places in the mountains, supply funds to ETA. And the United States, at the request of the Spanish government, have proscribed all of the ETA front organizations that we know about, or that the Spanish have suggested to us, and taken action to block those transfers of funds. I mean, it's a problem for ETA just as well as it is for Al-Qaeda. And I guess by some statistical measure, the incidents of Basque terrorism are down from the way they were 4 or 5 years ago, but it's still out there, and I guess demonstrates that this, as the president said on September 12th, 2001, that the war on terrorism is a long one, and victories are obscure and sometimes quiet, and the most important things is to share intelligence.
The question was, would you please discuss the implications of the fall of the dollar versus the euro?
I would say that the economist in me wants to say that the fall of the dollar against the euro is a reflection of market forces. It isn't just the trade deficit; it's the international transaction relationship, the United States, between capital flows and trade flows, all told, that constitute supply and demand for the dollar. The demand for the dollar is also affected by other countries that use the dollar as currency and developments there, and a whole lot of other complications that become hard to sort out. But it is indisputably true that because the United States has, for a decade, had a substantially faster rate of economic growth, job creation, every other indicator, because imports are essentially sensitive to our economic conditions and exports are sensitive to foreign economic conditions. This has aggravated the deficit, and the fact that the deficit is worse tends to depress the dollar on the marketplace. The only thing that has been our saving grace is the fact that the U.S. economy has been the place to invest. The New York and our other stock exchanges have been sources of considerable gains to foreigners investing in U.S. equities, and that inward flow seeking the returns has balanced the gap on the trade side. The Federal Reserve largely sets interest rates based on its charter and its responsibilities, and it is focused largely on the U.S. domestic economy. The foreign share of the U.S. economy has roughly doubled in the last 15 years or so, but it is still less than 20%. And so the Fed looks at the domestic economy and tries to set an interest rate that doesn't cause inflation and guarantees that the U.S. continues to grow on an even keel. I would I would not hazard a guess as to what the future will bring. It's funny, when the euro was introduced, it was introduced at 118, I think, to the dollar, or $118 to the euro. And when for the first 3 years it tumbled down to 87 or so, something. 86, yeah. Europeans were aghast and amazed and upset because they thought that it represented the market's evaluation of the euros and Europe generally and a lot of prestige items. Now that it's back up to 120, 122 or whatever it is today, they're equally aghast at the idea that somehow the market values them too much, or the market is demeaning the dollar. The only part of the U.S. administration that has anything to do with foreign exchange intervention is the Treasury Department. And if they had any plans, I would be the last person that they would tell. So I can't help you out in terms of the future.
The question is, does the American policy, the policy of the current administration with respect to international treaties, have an impact upon nations' view of our policies in other areas?
The simple answer to the question is yes, of course it does. Everything's related to everything else in diplomacy. And these kinds of decisions, and particularly the attention drawn to them in Europe and by European pundits and at conferences like this in Europe, as supposedly illustrative of American attitudes, affects people's impressions of what it is that we propose and do. I actually think that there's another point, though, that is interesting about Kyoto and the ICC in particular. And that is that they illustrate a somewhat worrisome trend towards European unilateralism. Now, why would I say that? And you might want to think about this for a minute. But in fact, take Kyoto first, because I guess it happened first. My old boss, Ambassador Stu Eisenstadt, was sent off to Kyoto and actually negotiated the Kyoto Treaty, but he had a very hard time in negotiating it because the Europeans had fixed in their mind the kinds of aspects that they wanted in the treaty, and they weren't prepared to negotiate, even with the Clinton administration, about them. They basically imposed them. And the interesting thing happened, there was a council of parties, which is essentially the operating body of Kyoto, that met in The Hague in the fall of 2000, after the U.S. presidential election was already known. And what we were looking for is, I don't want to get into the details of Kyoto, but Kyoto basically imposes caps on everybody in terms of CO2 emissions. The trouble with the cap is unless you have a trading arrangement, the cap falls very unequally. And so some parties that make above average benefits in terms of reductions of emissions can't share those gains with others. They can't trade the emissions. And we were looking for a system in which there could be international trading of emissions, because the fundamental flaw with Kyoto was that there was no reason to expect that the developing countries would ever join it. It was, this was the sort of core of Senator Hagel's problem. It was the biggest, fastest growing emitters of CO2 had no incentive to join the structure and a great deal of incentive to take advantage of the caps if it worked the way it said it would. And the European response was they'll be inspired by a good example and they will join in their own time. What we thought was that, okay, you don't like the system, but the problem is a serious one, requires action, and let's set up a system in which countries, and by expansion, individual emitters, companies and others within countries as well, but countries could trade. If you were over quota, you could buy quota from somebody who could achieve the reductions more cheaply. And at The Hague, we discussed what became known as FlexMex, or flexible mechanisms, to do that. And we had a tough negotiation, negotiated all night long with the European Union about a system in which you could meet half of your reduction obligations through FlexMex. And the European Union agreed in the room, walked out, and decided it was politically not viable and took it back. And they basically said, we decide what's going to be in Kyoto, and we don't have to take account of American interests at all. And they forced the Clinton administration out of Kyoto. And what happened when the Bush administration came in was, perfectly well admitted, we in the State Department, the diplomatic side of the administration, didn't really know about the letter to Senator Hagel that was done by the domestic side of the White House, and thought to be just a manifestation, a reaffirmation of the position that the president took during the campaign. And Europe exploded. This was such an insult, and it was so crudely done, and this, that, and the other thing. It wasn't done at all. No one actually thought it was significant. And this was a little bit of the learning curve. It was in February of 2001. The administration had hardly figured out how to send a letter, much less how to consult a letter. And that's no criticism of this administration. Every administration, the first couple of months are rocky. And you got to understand that these people come in, they come in from the outside, and they have the most heavy responsibilities of the whole world. But the EU cut us no slack. They cut us no slack on the policy, and they cut us no slack on the decision. They blew it up into a huge deal, which they didn't have to do. And they didn't listen to us when we tried to explain what we were doing. And part of our first summit with the EU in June of 2001 was explaining And the president announced a new policy and in terms of cooperation and research, and a lot of things we're doing now actually making some difference. We've got a cooperative program to develop hydrogen vehicles and hydrogen sort of carbon, what is it called, carbon sequestration, to take carbon out of the air in various and sundry other ways, which are all good things and we ought to be doing. And we really ought to be talking about how do we create incentives for China and India to come into the program. And then irony of all ironies, they now adopted their own flexible mechanisms program in Bonn a year and a half ago, and they're pushing it hard to get the Russians to sign up to the treaty, which they had walked away from in 2000. But that's neither here nor there. The ICC is a case in which the Clinton administration said that their problem with the ICC was simply that it was not attached to anything. There was no basis for the international community that set it up to have continuing oversight over its budgets, the decisions, or anything else. And that with the current state of the international community, you can't just create a court and put it out there. It's not like a domestic environment, which you can have a Supreme Court that doesn't report to the President of the United States or anyone else and is independent. That we felt that the ICC, as the criminal court for the Balkans and Rwanda and previous courts, should be created by the UN Security Council and answerable to it. And that was our main difference. And the EU again decided, no, we have this concept of the International Criminal Court. The United States just has to choose whether they want to adopt the EU model or not. And I actually think that from a standpoint of international law, if you go back in international law, and those of you who are lawyers know this, the international law has always been the law of consensus, the law of diplomatic immunity, the law of war, Grotius, all of the great parts of international law have been developed in which all the major actors in the international system agree that we ought to impose law of this sort and persuasion. The EU, with the International Criminal Court and with Kyoto and other kinds of institutions, basically said, we're going to decide because we are big and powerful and represent all of Western Europe, and you, United States, you, Canada, Australia, Brazil, you can just decide to sign up or not. And they have adopted the sort of vanguard theory of international law, which is similar to the way they have done European integration. And they have externalized their own experiences in the integrationist process. That may be right. It may, in fact, work for them, and it may work for the world. But at this stage, that is what has largely caused the differences. If they had agreed to vest the ICC and the Security Council, you'd see the United States, even this administration, be fully supportive of the ICC today. If they had decided in 2000 to introduce flexible mechanisms, and the new administration would be looking at a different Kyoto from the Kyoto that was agreed upon in '98, they might have come down differently on those things. And those are the consequences of a unilateral approach to transatlantic relations that they want us to get away from. They themselves also have to do the same.
Would you comment upon the public and governmental sensitivities to immigration both here and in Europe?
Well, I mean, they're clearly growing. The sensitivity towards immigrants in Europe is much higher than it is in this country. But in this country, you may have noticed that since the formation of the Homeland Security Department, there have been much more, and we're only seeing the first wave of the strengthened identity checks that take place on all travelers, but particularly on trans-border travelers. The idea of biometrics in passports, the idea of creating a database that can track entries and exits from the country and reconcile them. The administration recently had to recede from the proposal that they made to basically impose special obligations of registration and fingerprinting on all Muslim males between 20 and 45 or something like that as perhaps didn't have the law enforcement counterterrorism benefits that were associated with the costs. In Europe, there is great attention to the abuse of political asylum. Many immigrants, economic migrants, if you will, into Europe are actually present themselves as the border as seeking asylum. The entire asylum system is broken, particularly in Europe, but to some extent in this country, because of the volume. I mean, asylum used to be an individual decision that you would make an assessment of this individual and whether or not they had a legitimate fear of political persecution in the foreign society in which they lived. And then if they did, there was an obligation to provide asylum until such time as the political situation would change. Well, when there are hundreds of thousands of people seeking asylum every year, you don't have the ability to make those individualized, what did Juan Valdez do that leads him to be on the government's bad list in Venezuela? And is it legitimate, well-founded fear of persecution? And at the same time, the more that strategy succeeds, the more people show up and claim political asylum, and that whole system is completely broken. We have a different problem from Europe. The European problem is twofold. One, they have no tradition of multiculturalism. In fact, they have, to the extent they have a political tradition, is one of sort of cultural specificity. The French are French, the Germans are German, and the Danes are Danish, and they want to protect that kind of cultural specificity. There is no affirmative action in any way, shape, or form in most of the European Union. There is some effort at that in Britain today, but by and large, there really isn't. And so they have that kind of political tradition that is against our, it's not complementary. I mean, the United States has been built with immigrants, and we have our own kind of myth of the immigrant, which is a good thing from the standpoint of immigrants anyway. So the Europeans have that problem. On top of that, they have a demographic bust, which is phenomenal. There's an article, I think, in the Times this morning about Scotland, where they're actually aggressively looking for asylum seekers because the deaths in Scotland are substantially more than births, and people are living longer, so that the population is in a nosedive. Same is true in Italy and in France and in Germany. And unless there is essentially some influx, some regular influx of younger people, the social welfare state will collapse. They can't pay for it. They need people to do jobs, to pay taxes, to pay transfer payments to the retired communities, and they know this. If you talk to Europeans in a closed room, they can admit this, but they have a very hard time with it politically, which is less the problem that we have. The problem that we have is that we have a society that is open and tolerant, and also the fastest growing economy in the world. So it's not only seen to be a place to make your fortune, but a place where you'll be accepted in making your fortune. And so that has a tremendous magnet effect, perhaps exceeding that of our absorption capacity. We have our own demographic challenges, but nowhere near as severe as the Europeans. That's a long way of saying I don't know the answer to the question.
Would you compare what the Europeans did in Bosnia 10 years ago with what they might do today if a similar situation arose?
Good question. I think that if a similar situation arose today, they would handle it differently because of essentially failing the first time. I mean, the experience of the Balkans is still present in Europe. I mean, it's a kind of obsession in Holland because their troops were there when the Srebrenica massacre took place. But it is very present elsewhere. You hear them talk about the Balkans, and one of the reasons for European security and defense policy is the manifest failure of European militaries to make any difference whatsoever in the Balkans when Milosevic was running amok. But your question was, would the 10 new member states make a difference in addition to those differences, I guess? And I guess I would sort of make two observations. One, the 10 new member states bring a new area of wider Europe into play, if you will. If the Balkans were important to Western Europe, or the EU of 10 or 12 or 15, because they were neighbors. Slovenia has a long border with Austria, and they're just across the Adriatic from Italy, and so it was very real. The addition of this swath, I've never known how to pronounce it, of countries in Central Europe brings countries like Ukraine, Moldova, even by some extension the Caucasus, which is on the other side of the Black Sea from Romania and Bulgaria, into play as sort of new areas of interest. So clearly, developments in Moldova today, and developments in Belarus, and developments in Ukraine are much more important in Brussels than they used to be. And so the prospect of requiring EU intervention is much more immediate than, you could see a dispute in Moldova 10 years ago. The Europeans would say, oh, it's the Russians' problems, or it's at least not our problem. So there's that. The other impact, though, I think is probably negative in that there is, unless they fix the things that they're trying to fix in the current constitutional efforts, an EU of 25 would have much more trouble taking tough decisions, the decisions to use force and so forth. And I mentioned the ESDP in planning in the remarks, but there's another aspect to this that they are trying to put through, which is called, in true Brussels speak, structured cooperation. And what structured cooperation basically means is that, like the euro in a sense, a core, the French call it a noyau dur, sort of hard nut of more capable European countries could, as an EU enterprise, adopt, coordinate their militaries based on some strict criteria, and then be able to operate either in the name of the EU or in the name of the subgroup. And I think that that's also adopted with the background of the Balkans and the ability of some countries that just didn't like the use of force to frustrate the use of force, by writing very restrictive rules of engagement on the rest.
It's now 10 after 7, so I apologize to Dr. Faust and others who have questions for yielding to the inevitable, and thank our guest for what I think is a marvelously informative evening.
Thanks so much.